Imagine every book ever written by the greatest minds who ever lived. Every idea about how the universe works. Every calculation, every argument about the human body, the stars, and the soul. Now imagine all of it in one building. That building existed. It was real. It sat on the coast of Egypt for 7 centuries, and it held more human knowledge than anywhere else on Earth had ever held before, or would hold again for over 1,000 years. And then it was gone. You were probably taught it burned in one fire. One villain, one match, one tragic afternoon in history. That story is comfortable. It has a beginning and an end. It is also mostly wrong. What you are about to hear is not the story of a fire. It is the story of a decision made again and again by different people in different centuries who all arrived at the same conclusion. Some knowledge should not survive. And by the end of this, the question you will be left with is not who destroyed the library, it is what they saved for themselves. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what it actually was, because the scale of it is almost impossible to picture accurately. The Library of Alexandria was founded under Ptolemy II in the 3rd century before Christ, in a city built by Alexander the Great, and named after himself, because that is the kind of thing Alexander did. But the library wasn't a standalone building, it was one wing of something much larger, an institute called the Mausion, a temple dedicated to the Muses, the goddesses of art and science and inspiration. That word survived even when almost nothing else did. Every museum on Earth today carries the name of an institution almost nobody today can place the origin of. The mission of the Mausion was not modest. It was not collect some interesting books. The mission, as recorded by ancient sources, was to gather all human knowledge from every civilization that had ever produced it. Ptolemy's agents searched every ship that docked in Alexandria's harbor. If a vessel carried scrolls, those scrolls were confiscated, copied, and only the copy was returned to the owner. The original stayed in the library. Some historians call this the first recorded case of a government running an intelligence operation for the sole purpose of acquiring information. Not for war, for knowledge itself. At its peak, the library held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls. Historians still argue about the exact number, because the people who might have known were the same people who let it disappear. To put that in perspective, the next largest library in the ancient world held a fraction of that number, and Europe would not see a single collection of knowledge that large again until the printing press arrived, nearly 1,700 years later. Texts came from Greece, from Egypt, from Persia, from India, from as far as China. It wasn't a Greek library that happened to be in Egypt. It was the first true attempt in human history to bring everything a species had ever figured out into a single room. Inside those walls sat Aristotle's original manuscripts, mathematical treatises, medical texts describing surgeries and remedies centuries ahead of their time, and stacks of poetry, philosophy, and star charts. And this is where it stops being abstract, because inside that building, real people did things that should not have been possible yet. In 240 BC, a librarian named Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth, not roughly, accurately, using nothing but shadows, sticks, and geometry, and he got within a small margin of the true number. Around the same period, an astronomer named Aristarchus proposed something that should sound familiar, that the Earth orbits the Sun, and not the other way around. Copernicus gets the credit in every textbook. Aristarchus said it first, inside that library, 18 centuries earlier. Somewhere along the way, that fact simply stopped being taught. There was also Herophilus, a physician working in Alexandria a generation earlier, who did something almost nobody in the ancient world dared to do. He dissected human bodies, openly, and used what he found to map the nervous system for the first time in recorded history. Some of the terms he coined over 2,000 years ago are still used in anatomy textbooks today. And then there is Hero of Alexandria, working around 100 AD, who built a working steam-powered device, a sphere that spun using pressurized steam. He wasn't trying to start an industrial revolution. It was closer to a curiosity, a demonstration of principles. But the principle was there, sitting in Alexandria 1700 years before Britain figured out that steam could move the world. Which raises a question that should genuinely bother you. What if we were never supposed to rediscover any of this? What if the reason it took another millennium and a half to reinvent the steam engine is not because humanity was slow, it is because someone made sure we would have to start over from nothing? We don't know who made that decision yet, but we're about to find out. It wasn't one person, and it wasn't one moment. Here is the version almost everyone learns. Julius Caesar invaded Alexandria in 48 BC, set something on fire, the flames spread, the library burned to the ground, end of story. It is a clean story. It has one villain and one moment. It is also, according to almost every serious historian studying this today, not what happened. The truth is worse, in a way, because it's not one crime. It's a pattern of destruction that stretched across 700 years, carried out by different rulers, different religions, and different empires, who somehow all reached the same decision independently. The first fire is real. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar, trapped in Alexandria's harbor during a local conflict, ordered his own ships set alight to block the enemy fleet. The fire spread from the harbor into the city. According to the Roman writer Seneca, as many as 40,000 scrolls burned that day. But here is what almost nobody mentions. The library survived, damaged but still standing, and it kept functioning for centuries after Caesar left Egypt. The second blow came over 200 years later, in 273 AD, when Emperor Aurelian sacked Alexandria during a Roman civil war, and destroyed the royal quarter, the district where the library stood. No surviving ancient source explicitly states the library burned that day, but silence in the historical record is not the same thing as proof it survived. That absence of confirmation is going to become a pattern in this story. Watch for it. The third and most documented destruction happened in 391 AD, when Emperor Theophilus issued a decree ordering the destruction of pagan temples across the empire. The Serapeum, a temple that housed what historians believe was a daughter collection of the library, was demolished. Serious historians largely agree this is the point where the institution stopped functioning as a real center of scholarship. Not through fire this time, but through a religious decree and a demolition crew. And then, centuries later, in 642 AD, Alexandria fell to Arab conquest. A story spread that the Caliph, Omar, was asked what to do with the remaining books, and allegedly replied that if they agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they disagreed, they were dangerous, and ordered them destroyed. Historians are deeply divided on whether this actually happened, or whether it was propaganda written centuries later to discredit the conquest. We may never know which. There's a deeper problem sitting underneath all four of these accounts. Every single one was written decades, sometimes centuries, after the events it describes, by writers who had their own political and religious loyalties. The story of how the library died was assembled, piece by piece, by people who each had a reason to tell it a certain way. So here is the honest answer, the one that doesn't fit neatly into a single sentence for a textbook. Nobody burned all of it at once. It died slowly, through neglect, through underfunding, through political leaders who stopped caring whether it existed, and through several waves of targeted destruction spread across 7 centuries. Which brings us to the uncomfortable possibility sitting underneath all of this. What if the slow death wasn't just neglect? What if it was deliberate? Not one dramatic burning that historians could point to and condemn, but a long, quiet process of letting dangerous knowledge disappear gradually enough that nobody would ever be blamed for it. A single fire creates a villain, a slow death creates nothing but silence, and silence is much easier to get away with. Numbers like 400,000 scrolls don't mean much on their own, so let's talk about what those scrolls actually were. Because this is where the loss stops being abstract and starts feeling personal. Classicists who study this estimate that less than 1% of everything written in ancient Greek has survived to the present day, and that is not 1% of what sat inside Alexandria specifically, but 1% of the entire written output of an entire civilization. Alexandria held the largest share of that missing 99% that has ever existed in one place. Sappho was considered by the ancient world itself the greatest female poet who ever lived. Plato called her the 10th muse. Today, almost none of her work survives. What we have is fragments, torn pieces, single lines pulled from other people quoting her. We will never read most of what she wrote, not because it wasn't good enough to keep, because nobody protected it. Sophocles wrote roughly 120 plays across his lifetime. 7 survive in full. Everything else, gone. Even Aristotle, one of the most influential thinkers in human history, may not have survived intact. What scholars believe we have today are lecture notes, rough drafts meant for his own students, not his finished, published writings. The polished versions, the ones he actually intended the world to read, may be lost entirely. Democritus proposed an atomic theory of matter, the idea that everything is made of tiny, indivisible particles, over 2,400 years ago. Almost all of his writing is gone. We rebuilt atomic theory from scratch, centuries later, without knowing he had already gotten there. Aristarchus, the astronomer who placed the sun at the center of the solar system, has almost nothing of his own work remaining. We know what he theorized only because other ancient writers mentioned him in passing. And Hero of Alexandria, the man who built a working steam device in the 1st century, designed dozens of other machines we know almost nothing about. What else did he build? What else did he figure out? We will never know, because the only records were sitting in a building that no longer exists. Entire branches of ancient medicine, texts from Egypt, India, and Persia that predate Greek medical writing, appear to be gone completely, not just damaged, but genuinely unrecoverable, which means treatments, techniques, and diagnostic methods that may have taken centuries to discover again, if they were ever fully rediscovered at all. Ancient maps once housed in the library reportedly showed coastlines, trade routes, and territories with a level of detail that later mapmakers spent centuries trying to reconstruct. What did those maps know about the world that we still don't? Even Rome's own prophetic texts, the Sibylline books, texts the Roman state used to make major decisions, were deliberately destroyed at various points in history. Rulers didn't just lose these things by accident. Sometimes they burned them because the book said something inconvenient. 2 historians, Manetho in Egypt and Berossus in Babylon, were commissioned to write the complete histories of their own civilizations, specifically for libraries like this one. Their original texts are gone. Almost everything we know today about thousands of years of Egyptian and Babylonian history survives only because later writers happened to quote fragments of their work before the originals disappeared for good. So here is the question that should sit with you longer than any statistic. What if what we lost wasn't just philosophy and poetry, but something more practical, covering engineering, medicine, and energy itself? What if we spent the next 1,400 years slowly rediscovering things that had already been figured out, written down, and stored safely, before someone decided we shouldn't have access to them anymore? We don't know the answer, and that unknown is exactly the point. Here is the question historians tend to avoid, because it makes everyone uncomfortable. Every single power that contributed to the library's destruction also benefited from that destruction. That could be coincidence, 4 separate times, across 7 centuries, or it could be a pattern. Julius Caesar's fire was, on the surface, a military accident. He needed to block a harbor and lost control of the flames. But whatever burned that day was knowledge that, by its sheer scale, made Rome's own civilization look less advanced by comparison. A damaged rival collection is one less reminder of how far behind you actually are. The destruction of the Serapeum is where this gets genuinely uncomfortable, because the library at that point held texts that directly contradicted emerging church doctrine, including Gnostic writings, alternative accounts of creation, and pagan scientific work that quietly undermined the theological authority the church was trying to build. Theophilus was not simply a religious figure carrying out a decree. He was a political operator, and political operators understand something very old and very simple. Whoever controls the available knowledge controls what people are able to believe. The same logic applies to the conquest in 642 AD, regardless of whether the Omar story is true or fabricated. A library full of texts from rival civilizations is, functionally, a library full of arguments against your own authority. Destroying it or simply not protecting it removes competition for the version of history you want people to accept. Look at the pattern across all four events. Every single time a new power took control of Alexandria, one of the first things affected, directly or through neglect, was the library. Never the harbor, never the marketplace, always the library. This same pattern shows up again, centuries later, in a different city. When Mongol forces sacked Baghdad in 1258, they destroyed the House of Wisdom, the very institution that had preserved so much of what survived from Alexandria in the first place. Multiple historical accounts describe so many books thrown into the Tigris River that witnesses claimed the water ran black with ink for days. The knowledge that escaped one destruction met a second one 500 years later in a different empire for the exact same reason. That is not a coincidence you can explain away easily. Whoever controls the historical record controls what the next generation believes is even possible. So here's a question for you, and I actually want to know the answer. In the comments, tell me which of these four destructions you think was genuinely deliberate, and which one you think was an accident of history, because even professional historians studying this for their entire careers still cannot agree. Not everything burned. This is the part of the story that almost never gets told, because it's more complicated than a fire, and complicated stories don't fit neatly into a single sentence. Scholars had personal copies, private collectors owned duplicates. Knowledge doesn't just vanish the moment a building falls, it scatters. The Byzantine Empire preserved a portion of the ancient world's texts in Constantinople for centuries. Then, in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire, and fleeing scholars carried manuscripts west into Italy. That single migration of texts is one of the direct sparks behind the European Renaissance. Ancient Greek philosophy, science, and mathematics reintroduced to Western Europe by people running from a collapsing empire. The rebirth of human knowledge, quite literally carried out in the arms of refugees. Meanwhile, during the Islamic Golden Age, scholars in Baghdad's House of Wisdom translated and preserved enormous amounts of Greek scientific and philosophical writing. Many texts we still have today exist only because Arab scholars copied them between the 8th and 10th centuries. Centuries later, in the Spanish city of Toledo, another wave of scholars translated those Arabic copies into Latin, which is how much of what survived from ancient Greece eventually reached the rest of medieval Europe. The chain runs from Alexandria to Baghdad to Toledo, three civilizations passing the same knowledge hand to hand across nearly 1,000 years, each one saving what the last one had almost let go of. Think about that for a moment. Some of what survived from ancient Greece did not survive in Greece. It survived because a different civilization on a different continent decided it was worth keeping. And now we arrive at the part of this story that researchers still argue about openly. The Vatican archives contain roughly 53 miles of shelving. 53 miles. Established formally by Pope Paul V in 1612, though the collection itself is far older. The name Archivum Secretum technically translates to private, not secret. The Vatican has pointed this out repeatedly, but the translation matters far less than what is actually inside. Access today requires a formal application, verified academic credentials, and a narrow, specific research request. Nobody simply walks in and browses. Whatever is in there, the Vatican decides who gets close enough to look, and exactly what they are allowed to look for. What we know is in there is remarkable enough on its own. Trial transcripts from the prosecution of the Knights Templar in 1307, Henry VIII's petition for the annulment of his marriage, letters written by Mary, Queen of Scots, before her execution, documents that quietly shaped the direction of European history. But here is where it gets uncomfortable. Researchers have directly asked whether any scrolls or texts from Alexandria were ever transported to Rome before the library's various destructions. The Vatican has not confirmed this. The Vatican has also not denied it. And there's a detail that makes this harder to dismiss. The early papal archives themselves were repeatedly destroyed by fire over multiple centuries, which means that if copies of ancient texts ever did make their way to Rome, those copies may have traveled through more hands and further distances than the originals ever did. What if the most important texts were never actually destroyed at Alexandria at all? What if they were quietly removed before each wave of destruction and relocated somewhere safer, somewhere more controlled? Because knowledge, unlike a building, cannot really be destroyed once it exists in more than one place. It can only be moved. And whoever moves it decides who is allowed to see it next. We are not saying that is what happened. We are saying nobody with the authority to answer the question has ever fully answered it. In 2002, Egypt built a new Library of Alexandria on the approximate site of the original. It's called the Biblioteca Alexandrina. It cost roughly $220 million to build, and it can hold up to 8 million books. Inside, there is something almost poetic, a digital archive of the internet itself, a snapshot of the web preserved at regular intervals, an attempt to make sure the modern world's version of scrolls doesn't disappear the same way. Part of that digital collection exists in partnership with the Internet Archive, the same organization behind the Wayback Machine, which is the closest thing the modern internet has to a librarian standing between the present and total forgetting. Here's the irony nobody talks about. We are now trying to preserve digital knowledge using the exact same instinct the ancients had toward papyrus. In digital formats, hard drives, old file types, dead software become unreadable and obsolete in the same way papyrus becomes brittle and turns to dust. We think we solved the problem, we just changed the material. In 2020, Pope Francis opened previously classified Vatican archives from World War II, revealing documents about the Church's relationship with both Hitler and Mussolini during that period. He said, and this is worth hearing exactly as he framed it, that the Church is not afraid of history, that it loves it. What he did not open, and what remains closed to this day, is nearly everything predating the 17th century. The question researchers keep circling back to isn't really about what happened during World War II anymore. It's a different, older question. What was sitting in those archives before the archives officially began being cataloged at all? So here's the last question I want you to actually sit with, and I mean actually think about this one before you scroll away. If you could open one sealed archive anywhere in the world, any single collection humanity is not currently allowed to see, which one would you choose, and what do you honestly think is inside it? Put it in the comments. I read every single one. The Library of Alexandria did not burn in one dramatic moment. It died the way most important things die, slowly, through neglect, through politics, through a long series of decisions made by people who each concluded, in their own century, for their own reasons, that some knowledge was too dangerous to let survive. And the question nobody has ever been able to answer is the simplest one of all. How much of what we lost would have changed everything? The steam engine that Hero built in the 1st century. If that knowledge had survived intact, does the Industrial Revolution happen 1,000 years earlier? Does modern medicine arrive in the year 500 instead of the 1800s? Does the entire period we call the Dark Ages even happen at all? Somewhere in that same building was a physician who mapped the human nervous system, a historian who held the only complete record of a civilization's dynasties, and a machine that ran on steam a millennium and a half before anyone thought to build a factory around one. All of it sat within reach of the same shelves, at the same time, in the same city. We will never know. Because somewhere along the way, someone decided we shouldn't. Leave your theory in the comments, because in the end, the real question was never who burned the library. It's who decided what got to survive.